Thank you. Certainly, I think this is one of the areas where we need to be talking about different technologies. I understand different technologies were shared yesterday. And from my side, my participation is on the nuclear technology. The table of contents for my presentation is really to provide a context, talk about what about nuclear? Is it a living technology or a dying technology, or is it dead or alive? And then I talk about the South African landscape in terms of nuclear, as well as the spin-offs of using nuclear power, and then I'll conclude. Thank you very much. So starting off with the context on the next slide. I think locally, you don't need to be an academic nor anything, and you don't need research papers to know that we are facing the worst energy shortage ever. And 2023 being the worst year for the blackouts as outlined by ENCA. And you note that some analysts have indicated how much megawatt hours or gigawatt hours have been shed over the past years. And you can see there was a step increase from 2021 to 2022, but the problem had been progressively getting worse over the years. So it is very clear that we have an electricity crisis on our hands, and it's something that requires quite a lot of focus. And I know that the scientific community I'm talking to might cringe in terms of the background that I'm providing and the context, but this is empirical context which is felt right through by everyone else on the streets. So we don't need to go too academic on it at this point in time. The recent statements and discussions also talk to the fact that the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy spoke about nuclear and the intent of the 9.6 in the past, and how that did not go so well. You also note that Koeberg Unit 1 on the nuclear front has been down for mid-life improvements. It's been down for quite a while in the year, but it's scheduled to come back in November. But the grid is feeling the pinch of not having that nuclear unit on. Eskom, you know that, and it's said every day that what is saving us at this point in time is that we're burning diesel for emergency power, and these diesel plants or gas turbines are meant really to be providing energy only during peaking hours. However, we find that we're using them for base load. Quite expensive to the country, as well as taxing on the plants themselves. And it's important to state that all the plans that we tend to have in the country, they do show that there is a plan for nuclear with the recent plan that was published, the NIP 2050, talking about nuclear as part of the MDP. So locally, I can just summarize and say we're facing an energy crisis. There is talk around nuclear, but we're seeing little action being saved by diesel in addition to the calls for baseload power. Then if we move to the global arena, also the International Energy Agency has signaled that we are facing a global energy crisis. And this is due to a multiplicity of factors. Some of those factors relate to the recent Russia-Ukraine crisis, but this had been progressively getting worse as well in the global domain. And we see the likes of Engineering News and other publishers indicating that nuclear becomes the world's #2 source of clean electricity. The World Nuclear News talking about the Duke energy power systems, but also talking global about nuclear as an important aspect of the grid in the international domain. We're seeing some startups of new nuclear plants in different parts of the world, especially in some of the developed and the developing nations alike. Then this brings me to the point, what about nuclear? We're having an energy crisis both locally and globally. If we talk about nuclear, this is a telling story that this is a an industry that is alive. We currently have about 410 nuclear reactors in operation, and you'll see the legend on the graph that the darker blue is the net electrical capacity in gigawatts, as well as the light blue being the number of reactors. So in total, we've got about 410 reactors to the installed capacity of about 368 gigawatts globally. And noting that South Africa only contributes about 1,800 of that 368, because we only have 2 reactors, as the map shows. And the dominant areas that you'll see is that the North America is very dominant, followed by Europe, the western part of Europe, and Asia. And you'll see in the next slides that Asia is actually moving faster, and it will dominate both America and Europe. And then you get Europe, which is Central and Eastern Europe, which is the former Soviet bloc, also in the order of about 50-something reactors. And then Asia and Middle East dwindling down. But the interesting thing about Middle East is we're seeing a growth. For example, the United Arab Emirates has added 3 units in the last 5 years or so, and they are continuing to build one. So as we stand today, it's important to note that nuclear energy contributed to about 10.4% towards the global energy supply in the year 2022 globally. In South Africa, we currently, according to our grid of about 53,000 megawatts installed capacity, nuclear is about 3.5% of that. But in terms of the energy sent out in the year under review, which is 2022, we have nuclear has contributed about 4.9%, close to 5% of the energy into the grid. In terms of the reactors under construction, we've said 410 reactors in operation. Now let's look at the reactors under construction. This previous slide did say that we've got about 57 reactors that are being constructed worldwide. You can see the dominant force being China and India, and they are doing reactors mostly that you can argue that in terms of the design, these are the reactors that are built in Europe and in the US, typically, with some coming from the Eastern Europe as well. Got Turkey building quite a couple, as well as the Republic of Korea, which are very dominant. Important feature is Egypt, that is showing to be building 3 using VVR technology, and there will be in the African continent, the 2 that we have in South Africa. If you add that 3, so Africa as a continent will start to grow, getting to closer to 10 units as we move forward. But also, what I want to highlight is that even what is considered to be the old nuclear countries and even the developed countries, they are continuing to build. The United Kingdom is starting to show them, the likes of Russia and France and the other countries. United States of America still features with 1 unit, having commissioned 1 unit. But also important to note that we've had quite a couple of connections, just the center part of the graph that you see in front of you, that have had a few connections just in 2023. So nations are continuing to build, nations are continuing to synchronize units onto the grid that are powered by nuclear. And the source for this information for the 2 graphs is the PRIS, the IAEA PRIS, which stands for Power Reactor Information System, under the auspices of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So from where we sit, we're seeing that there's 410 in operation and about 57 that is under construction. So this technology is going to be alive for quite a couple of years to come. What about South Africa? South Africa, in terms of the policy framework, we do have a National Energy Act of 2008, which gives birth or gives rise to the Integrated Energy Plan, which is right in the middle there. The beautiful thing about the Integrated Energy Plan is that it talks about 8 objectives. 1 being security of supply, maximizing the cost of energy, promoting job creation and localization, minimizing the environmental impacts, minimizing water consumption, diversifying the security of supply, promoting energy efficiency, as well as promoting energy access. Globally clustered those as three elements. It is the economic development, the social development, as well as the environmental sustainability. Moving from the integrated energy plan, we have the integrated resource plan for electricity, which talks about the diversity in the electricity domain. That is where we're seeing a huge growth in the renewable sector, whilst both the base load in the form of coal and nuclear have remained stagnant for the last couple of years. I did speak earlier on about the National Infrastructure Plan of 2050 that talks about also utilizing different technologies, and nuclear does feature in there. Similarly, on the integrated resource plan above, nuclear does feature in there in the form that we need to get going with the planning because nuclear is one of the identified technologies to move forward with. The Nuclear Energy Act also does come into play on the right, wherein it talks about many things, also the institutional arrangements about nuclear. And then we also have the National Nuclear Regulator Act of 1999, which is the Regulators Act, an act that brings to life our regulator. As we all know, nuclear is subject to stringent regulations, and it is important that as we move into the nuclear discussions, the regulatory aspect becomes a dominant force because you need to have a strong regulator to run a robust nuclear industry. These are the key enablers for our technology, which is nuclear. In terms of the enablers for South Africa to energy security, we need to end the current crisis as a starting point and then move on to securing our sustainability into the future. First of all, I want to state that the policies require review. So we need to change the mindset and the labeling of energy technologies. What we had seen recently is one technology set fighting the other technology set, pulling the other. The pulling down syndrome has really become very prevalent in the space. And it is important that what is presented, be it the IEP or the IRP, those have been researched, and the empirical evidence does show itself that what is considered in the policy framework, it is important technology that must be accepted. Also, the energy mix includes careful selection, carefully selected technologies for the needs of this country. And that mix, it must not be the mix because it favors you today and you start pulling the other people down. So in terms of our policies that we have, we need to really look at implementing our policies in earnest, because I think South Africa has got a very good mix as it is presented in the policy documents. The next thing that I'd like to talk about is the planning horizon. We've noted that nations globally, when they talk energy, they talk not just for the next 5 years, 10 years, they talk 50 years to 70 years to 100 years. So we need to really have an energy planning framework that looks so far ahead. We are, in this country, beneficiaries of that because the coal industry that has set this country afoot in terms of cheap and reliable electricity was started in the 70s. And it had a much longer view, many more decades to come. And in terms of the planning horizons, we need to ensure that the energy needs for the country are fully considering the view that we have had load shedding in the past 16 years or so. So you cannot ignore that we've had energy starvation, so which means we've been dwindling in energy poverty for the last couple of years. So whatever we do, energy availability and energy security must be top of mind all the time. And the frequency of reviewing our policies sometimes gets us into a tangle because some people, and this is not investor friendly, because if you're saying you're going to be reviewing a policy every 2 years or every year, what you might be putting yourselves in a disadvantage of is that if things change from one end of the pendulum to the other end every time there is a review, then investors are going to run away and they're going to go to a more robust environment where policy certainty is guaranteed. And following from that is the building. We need to start building plants. What is required for the next 3, 5, or 10 years should be in the build stage today, because these plants take a little bit of a while to build, but they last for many, many years. So nuclear power plants, as we talk about it now, we should be starting to build to augment the current capacity that we have on the grid. And I know there's always a talk about skills. Do we have the skills? Skills will always follow projects. So if you don't build, you're going to have a skills drain from the country. But if you start building any kind of project, we've seen it with the Middle East when they were building like the cities like Dubai. Skills went there because there were projects, vibrant projects. We see it in the building of nuclear power plants in the United Arab Emirates. Skills flew in there from the US, from South Africa, from all over the globe. So let's start doing something, and we're going to be attracting talent moving forward. South Africa's energy mix is actually a very diverse mix, and it has been diverse for a while, but even more prevalent in the last couple of years, wherein there's been a massive introduction of solar and wind. So we've got coal and diesel, nuclear, gas, and hydro, which are really the base load sources of energy. And then the intermittent being solar and wind and battery storage. But battery storage can also be used depending on how the battery is powered. It can be battery that is storing energy from solar or wind, or it can also be battery that is storing water from hydro, as it is the case with the pump storage schemes that we have in this country that are running so well. So we see different classifications, base load versus intermittent energy as a starting point. But as we go now to the taxonomy in terms of naming these technologies further granularly, is that we see the green energy in the form of solar and wind, but let's attest that is intermittent. And then if you go to the other side, we see the green base load in the form of hydro, full hydro, not pump storage. And then we see a recent movement in terms of the taxonomy, especially by the European Union, wherein nuclear and gas were put in the clean energy taxonomy. And that is very important for investment going forward. And many countries and many regions are following suit. And I think the concern now becomes the coal and the diesel. And I think the concept of cleaner coal and probably even cleaner diesel needs to be explored, because these are the natural resources that all countries have. Therefore, we need a balanced view to ensure security of supply and commitment to climate goals. No technology can single-handedly resolve this issue. We need a balanced view in terms of what has been termed as the energy trilemma. And trilemma in the sense of the first aspect being, and most important, energy security. And then environmental responsibility and the economics thereof. Because if you don't have the energy, then there's not much to talk about the environmental responsibility as well as the economics. Energy needs to lead. It must be the dog that wags the tail. So spin-offs in terms of nuclear, because we do hear many analysts and inputs from different people. If you are to go today and download an app called Electricity Maps, I just did a download this morning, to show a snapshot of electricity consumption across the world. And you'll see at the bottom right of that graph that we see the carbon intensity of the technologies that we are using. The darker it gets, the more dirty it is per kilowatt hour generated, and the greener it is, the more cleaner it is. So it is telling that there are many countries that are more closer to the green side of life than to the darker side of life. And as you will see, there are some greens right at the top of the world in the form of France, those who can understand the map. and Norway and Finland, Canada and the Ontario aspect, Ontario side. South America, we know what happens there. But I think if we move on to the next slide, and you can download this and you can check on a daily basis, hourly basis, how the countries are doing. But most importantly on this map, before we move to the next slide, is a country like Germany, which sits next to France. It is very dark, more like South Africa, despite having installed lots of intermittent energy sources, because they need base load for consumption. And they're currently using coal as a source that provides them electricity with some imports. And with this app, you can actually even check the imports and the exports. Then if you look at who has actually decarbonized, and I thought that previous slide was the preamble to this. If you look at Brazil and you compare it with the previous slide, you'll know that Brazil is dominated by hydro. And that's how they've managed to decarbonize their electricity grid with some nuclear units. Then we move to France, and France, as we know, it's got abundant nuclear power plants. They've managed to decarbonize their grid. They've got some hydro, and they do fill in with some of the intermittent sources. Ontario in Canada, lots of nuclear as well as hydro. Sweden, quite a bit of hydro, as well as nuclear. But you can see the theme predominantly on this. People have decarbonized their grid. It is people who have abundant hydro as well as nuclear. And with that, if you don't have hydro like South Africa, that is a water-starved country, your best bet to decarbonizing the grid is to use nuclear technology, just like France has done, as shown in this slide. So this is a very telling picture that the spin-offs and some of the countries that are touted to be leading the renewable agenda, and I have no issues with renewables. Renewables need to grow. We need to learn from them because they have been ignored for far too long. But if we talk about energy security today, nuclear and hydro are your best bets. And for South Africa, I think nuclear needs to be featuring much stronger than what we are seeing at this point in time, whilst building the other technologies in parallel. Whilst I've just spoken in the previous slide around the decarbonization, which is the environmental footprint, the other part of the energy trilemma is the pricing. What does it cost the consumer at the user point? We've just taken a snapshot from Europe, because they've got this information quite easily accessible. And you'll see that the pricing, we've got Ireland and Germany very high compared to the EU average of 28.3. And if you go to countries that I've just shown in the previous slide, you will see that they are below the EU average. So which means your nuclear and your hydro will definitely give you returns in terms of energy security because they are baseload. They will give you a benefit in terms of the environmental footprint, and they will also give you a benefit in terms of the pricing at the consumer level. And this issue around pricing and the finances around nuclear project, I think is a misnomer, because everyone will always be talking about how much it costs to build a nuclear power plant, that you've got huge capital costs, but how to operate it in terms of the levelized cost of energy. You will see that that becomes a very low figure. So I think what's important, you need to turn the discussion and say, what does it cost the consumer in the short and the long term? And you can see for nuclear intensive countries that the consumer is paying little. And I take it to your motor car. No one knows how much it costs to build a rig that is extracting gas or petrol wherever before it's being refined, before it's being transported. What matters mostly is how much does it cost at the pump? And I think this becomes a reasonable discussion to have. So I spoke about the energy trilemma, and we can see that on all three aspects, nuclear hits the sweet spot. And as I've just said now, nuclear offers base load, and all countries have grown on the back of baseload power supply, and nuclear is baseload. Environmental compliance, I've said nuclear is clean, is under the clean energy taxonomy, does not have the greenhouse emissions. Affordability, it is the cheapest form of baseload alongside hydro. And as we conclude, I must state that energy, as we all know, is an enabler for development. South Africa has been very stifled by the lack of energy. We've seen investments leaving this country that had the potential of being sunk here and keeping jobs here. And like I said, nations have developed on the backbone of abundant baseload without exception. South Africa was the leading example of that. We had cheapest electricity. It invited quite a lot of investors to come to this country. The South Africa's policy framework can give us the best energy system if utilized appropriately, and if we do implement and move forward. Less talk, but more action. Nuclear energy continues to power nations with reliable and affordable baseload. Some nations are building massively to capitalize on additional benefits of decarbonizing their economies. I've shown China is building en masse, India, and some of the other countries that were shown in the slide. So energy experts and academics need to take up their role of advising appropriately on the technical capabilities of the various technologies. No technology is immune from disadvantages. All technologies have got advantages and disadvantages. And we need to make sure that we build on the advantages while we're trying to mitigate on what the disadvantages for those technologies are. Most importantly, the nuclear industry needs to invest in public awareness and educational campaigns in order to demystify nuclear energy. And I think that goes without saying that when you mention the word nuclear, everyone cringes, even though nuclear in France is used quite easily, because that's one of the countries that has got many nuclear plants. Even the USA has got even more, but China will soon surpass that. So we need to demystify so that people understand that this technology is there, this technology is growing globally. With that, Chairperson, Program Director, thank you very much, and back to you.
How and where does South African nuclear plants safely discard nuclear waste?
Certainly, thank you very much. So the nuclear waste is categorized generally into three forms. There's what is called low-level waste, which is really material that is used in the form of, it's actually got low radioactivity, followed by what is called medium-level waste, and those are contained in drums, and they are sent to be stored in a well-studied and well-regulated repository called the Valputs, somewhere in the Northern Cape. So that's where it's stored for the low-level and medium waste. But for what is traditionally called high-level waste, which is used nuclear fuel from the reactors, at this point in time, it is stored at the facilities. For nuclear power plants, it's stored at Koeberg in Cape Town. For NETSA, it is stored here in Pelindaba, under strict regulations of the nuclear regulator, as well as the international obligations in the form of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And also the shielding that is provided to that which is sent to Valputs. It's put in concrete drums and waste drums, and the background radiation on the sides of those drums is probably better than in some of the places that we live in that have got most granite rocks close by.
This is an interesting presentation. Nuclear new build will result in an increased job opportunities, both direct and indirect. My worry is that South Africa has taken too long to make new nuclear build a reality. This leads to lower but much needed baseload capacity as the economy grew. What is the potential timeline to implement this program now to alleviate a supply pressure, especially in light of load shedding and potential export costs on carbon-intensive industries? What can we learn from Egypt from conceptualizing the program to implementation?
Thank you. I think that's a very good question. How countries have done it? You see record construction timelines in the UAE recently with the 3 units, which was in the order of 6 to 7 years. In China, we see even shorter durations for big nuclear plants, size of Quebec and slightly above. You see those number of years primarily because the planning gets to be done quite well upfront. So that because the construction time that is counted for nuclear plants is when you start now having the regulator saying, construct the power plant. We are happy with your design and everything. One of the facilities that I visited, where they were building 6 nuclear units, a license had been granted for one, and the other 5, it had not been granted, but all the infrastructure, the roads leading to the site, the roads around the site, the infrastructure in terms of electrical supplies that are needed, everything, the holes had been dug, getting ready to say you can start the nuclear-related foundation or the foundation for the facility that will be hosting the nuclear components. So there's a lot of upfront planning. There's a lot of what is generally called in heavy construction activities, the early site works that can be done. And if you do those well, you actually shorten the actual construction of time. It's like having to construct your house. If you don't have the authorization by the local council as yet, in the form of approved plans and everything else, you can do a whole lot of things around your yard, wherein you clear it off, you get ready for site establishment. So it talks about being proactive in terms of your planning. That's your traditional plans. But now the talk is around the small modular reactors. And these small modular reactors, I would say that there's only one that is currently in operation in China, which takes the form of what we used to have here as a PBMR that was in concept. These small modular reactors promise to even have shorter construction time in the order of 3 to 4 years from the actual start of nuclear construction to commissioning and connection to the grid and commercializing it. So there's a definite move, and I think the nuclear industry still has a lot to learn from many industries in the form of licensing. The aeronautics industry is an area that the nuclear industry needs to learn from. In that, if a Boeing is licensed to land in one country, it generally is licensed to land in many countries because there is a link and an agreement between the different air regulators. I made a Boeing or an Airbus or whatever name of the plane so that I'm not accused to be biased towards one company versus the others. So in terms of regulation, I think there's a lot we can learn which can expedite the timelines. In terms of operations, nuclear operates in a very much like an international community that shares lessons. Already we are miles ahead. But in terms of the construction as well, there are many components that are classified as nuclear equipment, which is actually not nuclear equipment. We should move towards standardizing much of the equipment to be more like your off-the-shelf components, which are industry, which meet the general industry standards.
Have sites been identified for new nuclear reactors?
South Africa had 5 nuclear sites identified in the old program. And I think now I'll speak and say, I don't know what is happening at this point in time, but 5 sites were identified. There were 2 sites in the Northern Cape and closer to the Namibian side in the Atlantic Ocean. There's a Quebec site, which currently houses Quebec units, and it still has more land to accommodate more units. There was a site near Hermanus called Bantam's Klip. There's also a site in the Eastern Cape near Jeffreys Bay called Tayspunt. Those are the sites that were identified in the 80s. I want to believe that more sites could be identified in this country, provided, obviously, the company that's given the mandate to do that site identification is done. And I must add on and say that for the Tayspunt site and the Denefontein site, which is where Quebec is, lots of work has been done in the form of the environmental impact assessments. That work was submitted to the Department of Environmental Affairs back then, it's DFF now. and also in the form of the nuclear site installation license applications, which have been sent to the National Nuclear Regulator. So there's a lot of publicly available information, especially for those two sites for nuclear power. But I believe more can be identified. And I think we.
Is South Africa considering using nuclear to solve the electricity problem? If yes, when can we expect to see progress in this area?
Yes, I think the integrated resource plan does have nuclear in it, even though, let me state that whilst we have 2 units that are already in operation, for new megawatts coming onto the grid between now and 2030, which is when it ends, there is 0 nuclear. And for me, I'm looking forward to the announcement that said a new integrated resource plan for electricity will be coming out for public comment, I think this week or next week. And I'm looking with hawk's eyes to see what it says about nuclear.
What factors are taken into account for selecting a nuclear site? That's a question from Megan Cole.
Multiple factors. And I think nuclear sites are probably the most studied sites on this earth. And most importantly is the seismicity. We did, as South Africa, a seismic study, seismic analysis for the site near Jeffreys Bay. It was the first of a kind internationally. It had international experts all the way from the US and the UK. It's called, it's under what is called the SHAC system, which is near seismic hazard assessment. It had been done, I think, in Switzerland, and it failed. Lessons were learned, and South Africa was the first one to publish those studies. And those are also published internationally, even in international journals. So seismicity becomes important. But it's everything to air and wind speeds on the site, the topography of the site, availability of water, access to the site itself, the development around the site in terms of how dense, in terms of population density you have, the feasibility of executing an emergency plan, if you have to have one. So it's a whole range of studies. And like I'm saying, I think nuclear plants are the most studied sites. Nuclear sites are the most studied sites. But also, I must add that people can just, for themselves, check on the websites, the EIA that has been done for the 2 sites under question to see the extent of the studies done, as well as the application to the NNR for the nuclear siting installation.
Is 2.5 gigawatt nuclear allocation adequate to attract long-term investments? Should South Africa's nuclear build focus on conventional nuclear technology or move to the next generation of nuclear technology, for example, SMRs, etc.?
A very good question from my colleague, Dr. Mate. Thanks for the question. For me, if you had to ask me, I think 2.5 gigawatts is a drop in an ocean. As you can see on the previous slides, countries that have decarbonized, they are well above 20% of nuclear installed capacity in those respective countries. Taking into account that we don't have hydro in this country because we are a water-scarce country, I would imagine that nuclear needs to play a role in the order of 30% and above. So 30% currently with an installed grid of about 53 gigawatts would be in the form of 30% of installed capacity. I would say that's about the good ballpark to attract, number one, industry, because when you have these plants coming through, you have an industry that comes with them, and it is important that you keep them going with in terms of refurbishments that will be needed. We've seen it, I think France has got a very classical case of having a well-oiled machine in terms of the industry that supplies and supports the nuclear power industry. So I think 2.5 is a drop in an ocean. And as you can tell, that will be my input to the IRP when it comes up, if any nuclear capacity is lower than 20-30%.
Right.
And the second part of that question was whether we need to focus on small or big plants in the form of traditional plants or the small modular reactors. I want to believe that we need to focus on both. There is a room for big plants because they provide reliable base load for 60 years. And the small plants are still not commercially proven. We're still talking about concepts of different SMRs. And my view is that whilst we focus on the big plants to resolve the issue, as soon as those plants get commissioned, we need to look at the new and the upcoming SMR, small modular reactors.
Given the major issues with construction and operation of Medupi and Kusile, is it wise to build nuclear plants in South Africa from a safety point of view?
If we look at the case studies that are in the public domain for Medupi and Kusile, there is no safety issue that comes with it. It was just construction delays. What I always say is that major plants, major projects, not even plants, be it roads, be it stadiums, be it whatever, they fail not because they're nuclear, they fail because they're huge infrastructure projects that require upfront planning. So you need to do proper planning, obviously not plan until the end of time, but plan with a clear view of milestones. So planning becomes very important. And my belief is that this country has got the capability to build nuclear power plants. And as you know, a plant designer and constructor will come in supplemented by the South African expertise as well. You don't just say South Africans, here's a plant on paper, build it on your own. The original equipment manufacturer or the original designer will come and support and make sure that we build the plant according to the design. So we have more than adequate capability and capacity to build nuclear plants. And I think the delays in the other coal plants is an issue of planning, and that's what the studies have shown.